Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to UnSpun, episode number 71. I'm your host, Jan Irvin. Jacob Duellman is back, and lots of exciting research to cover. And boy, wow. Well, you know, Jacob's been doing a lot of research on... hold on, somebody's sending me a Skype message here. Jacob's been doing a lot of research on the history. Well, we had started with Thomas Harrison, and I'll let Jacob do the recap, but this has led into a whole new rabbit hole of discovery, essentially, and which is actually, interestingly, tying back into from various different angles into the work of Anatoly Fomenko, who wrote this book, History, Fiction, or Science, and about 100 other books on the topic of the problems with chronology. And last week's show was sort of an attempt to, you know, prepare the audience for this topic. It didn't go quite as I had hoped, but we did lay out a few points that will help to build towards this narrative that we're trying to lay out for people to understand on how these people have basically this sort of faked history, faked chronology, created a new narrative, you know, and sort of the players on one side, and we're beginning actually to see a lap between Anatoly Fomenko's research and you know, what you're discovering, Jacob, you know, that we started out, you know, 2 months ago discussing. So anyway, why don't you start off by giving the audience, you know, sort of a rehash of some of the things that we've covered in the earlier shows that lead up to now, and then we'll dive into the new research.
Certainly. So the way I kind of came into this research was right after the shows with Jason Horsley, where you guys discussed the Orinia cult and mass observation. And a gentleman by the name of Thomas Harrison was brought up during that episode. And some information kind of came to light about a poem he had written while he was studying the cannibals in the New Hebrides, titled Coconut Moon. And then a request was brought out by you and Joe to try to source where this poem actually was, because it was printed in the New Statesman underneath a letter by Charles Madge, which is trying to create who was also trying to create an anthropology of ourselves. Which is kind of interesting about that is Charles Madge is not an anthropologist; he's a poet and an academic, and Thomas Harrison is an anthropologist and an ethnologist and not a poet. And he writes a poem about anthropology and cannibalism and the philosophy of this dying tribe out in the New Hebrides. And what's kind of interesting about savage civilization is that Thomas Harrison, when he says savage civilization, he's not discussing the cannibals in the New Hebrides. He's discussing the people in London and England and calling the West basically savages. He talks about that in his book. And what's interesting about that book is that he didn't write that in the New Hebrides. He wrote everything except the poem Coconut Moon at home in England, if I phrase that correctly. Everything was written in England except for the poem Coconut Moon. So Savage Civilization was picked up by Victor Gollancz, and this was Thomas Harrison's first book that he ever published. And what's interesting about this is that Victor Gollancz started the Left Book Club, which released Savage Civilization, and their first advertisement introducing the club was also put in the New Statesman. And if we look at the New Statesman in my brain, actually I should probably pull that up and look at that.
Yeah, why don't we just share a screen there? I'm just
going to minimize my Zoom here a second.
I'll while you're getting that, I'll just show it on my side here. But I've got the Left Book Club up there so that they can see that. Here's Brigadier General Thomas Harrison. And so he's the one that wrote the poem that he was just talking about. He's also basically the founder of mass observation that all of this is going to be tying into. And he's published under the Left Book Club, created by Victor Gollancz. And it just goes up from there. Victor Gollancz was a member of the Fabian Society, which we've done extensive shows on previously. with you and Joe, etc., going into all of this information here. George Orwell, of course, Aldous Huxley, Annie Besant, all of these people were members of the Fabians. But do you have yours going now?
Yeah, I can do the share screen here. Let's see.
Sure.
Okay, so now we are looking at the New Statesman on my brain.
Okay.
Now, if we look underneath, but first we could look up as above, so below. So
your video is going haywire a bit there.
Is it? I'm not seeing anything on my screen that would indicate what's going on. So
it's glitching on and off, so your video card is probably being overworked, unfortunately.
Well, that's a shame. We'll have to just stop screen, and I'll just kind of walk it through while you share the screen through the web. How about we just do that, and my voice will just be your mouse pointer.
Okay, so let me find that. Let me find that link you just sent me for that. Sorry, folks. So here, let's see. You had just sent me the link, right, to yours?
Yes. Let's see here.
All right, so we're looking up, what was it, the New Statesman?
Yeah, so we're looking at the New Statesman screen. And if you...
New
Statesman.
New Statesman, there we go. All right, now we've got it on screen here.
And you can kind of see the collection of characters who are associated with this. Up above, you see Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, John Maynard Keynes, Sidney Webb. These are all high-profile Fabians, created the Fabian Society, and they're all key funders and creators of the New Statesman. John Maynard Keynes actually acquired the New Statesman after it was initially founded, and he merged it with his paper. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think if you clicked on his name, you'd find it. It might be like The Observer or something like that.
I think it was The Observer, and then I think I have that in mind. Let me check that very quickly here. So here's mine. Here we go.
And I can't see any of the screen either.
Yeah, well, you would have to watch it on YouTube to be able to see what I'm showing. So I don't see it in mine either, so I don't see it on yours.
Okay, so I'll have to resource that.
And Athenaeum.
Oh, that's interesting. That Aldous Huxley used to publish under a pseudonym Autolux for that publication, Anatheum.
Okay.
So that's just another interesting link there. We have Aldous Huxley tied to John Maynard Keynes' publication. So,
and of course, Keynes was working with the London School of Economics, where Wasson was working, and Wasson, of course, worked with Huxley. So there's another connection right back to Huxley.
And that's a Fabian creation, so that goes right back to the Fabian Society.
One of these days, I need to finish my "Where's Aldous Huxley" article. It's based on Where's Waldo. It's like all those drawings with the Waldo cartoon character, because everywhere you turn, there's a Huxley, especially Aldous.
There's actually, I wonder if that book I just got in the mail, because there's not just Aldous that shows up. I'm just grabbing it right now. I have this Gollancz publication, as you can see. It's called "What Is Science?" I don't know if the camera can see it or not, because we don't have that up. But there's an article in here by Julian Huxley on genetics, actually. And all these articles are published specifically for Victor Gollancz's publication, What is Science? So that's interesting. We have Jacob Bernowski in there, who is tied to mass observation as well. And cybernetics, I believe. Is that correct? Jacob Bernowski, cybernetics?
Let's see.
I feel like you've mentioned that once before, and I'm kind of tying that off of just a conversation.
Here, let me just... what was the name again?
Jacob Bernowski.
I do not have that connected to mine under cybernetics. Of course, Gregory Bateson and the CIA is all over cybernetics there. Okay,
so that might be a misreference, but I can say that he did write the Ascent of Man and did the documentary series. And he actually is involved with measuring, I think it was an Australopithecine skull, and he did the mathematics to try to identify the measurements of it to figure out what it was. And that was one of his crowning achievements, moving from mathematics to archaeology.
This is the official publication of the Macy Conferences, 1946 to 1953, which, of course, was all done under... Well, the Macy Conferences was a front for the CIA, so...
Okay, so that's where the misfire was.
That's where it's that's well published that the Macy Conferences and cybernetics, Macy Conferences right there, the Macy Conferences, the Macy Foundation... which is still in existence today, was a big front for funding the CIA's MKUltra program.
See, everything just kind of ties back. So we're looking at this publication, and we're talking about Huxley and Anathema, which was going back to John Maynard Keynes and his publication, which is going back to the New Statesman. So just kind of getting us back on track. So if you look at the New Statesman, do you still have that brain shared up?
Let me pull that up here. All right.
So if there's a man by the name of Gerald Gould. If you click on his name.
Is it up on top or below?
He's down below. Actually, before we do Gerald Gould, let's do G.D.H. Cole. He's actually a little bit more interesting.
G.D.H. Cole.
Yeah, I just need to get myself back there now.
Got it. It's up.
So George Douglas Howard Cole, he ran the propaganda for, I think it was which ministry was it here? I have to scroll through. But he was a propagandist during World War I. He was associated with the Left Book Club, did a lot of publications for them. He was part of the Society for Socialist Inquiry and Propaganda. And he also, I think, he wrote the biography on Richard Carlisle, who did the unauthorized handbook on Freemasonry. So he's an interesting chap.
All right, so let's go back to this other character here. You had Gerald Gould.
Yeah, so now Gerald Gould is Victor Gollantz's shill. So Gerald Gould is a literary reviewer, and what Victor Gollancz would do when he needed a book that he wanted to promote was he'd go to Gerald.
So this guy, let me just interject there. This it sounds to me like Gerald Gould is that same guy that I found in Wasson stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where Wasson he's got oh, come on, Alan Nevins in the background, right? And so he's got this guy Nevins in the background. And he's telling them he's telling Nevins, and sorry, I'm just looking for the article here. Sorry, folks. He's telling Alan Nevins what to write in here. Let's see. Yeah, he's telling Nevins what to write about J.P. Morgan's Hull Carbine affair, and then Wasson would turn and cite Nevins as an appeal to authority in his own arguments in the matter, which is an obvious conflict of interest, not to mention that somebody working in PR for Morgan might likewise have a conflict of interest in writing an account on the matter. And then we have Wasson and Alan Nevins' personal letters, or Wasson and his letters to Charles McLean Andrews. These letters, by the way, folks, are directly out of Yale. I pulled these out of the Charles McLean Andrews archives at Yale, and he was a famous Yale historian. And he and Wasson had these little conspiracies going in the background where they're telling, they're in the background, they're telling each other the official version of the story. And then we see that version being pushed out in the public, which is what I also covered in my article, Spies in Academic Clothing here.
Yeah, and actually, Gerald, that does kind of sound familiar what Gerald Gould does. And like a little bit of background of his was before he was a literary reviewer, he was part of Masterman's Wellington House propaganda department during World War I. So he's another one of those World War I propagandists. And I think they were involved with propagandizing against the United States to get them into the war, if I remember correctly, that division.
Interesting. Rudyard Kipling is right there, and we've talked about him in the past. And, of course, H.G. Wells was tutor to Aldous Huxley. And if you go into my brain, you'll see H.G. Wells connect into all things, from there. Here, just to show that very quickly. So where is Wells? Here's H.G. Wells. I mean...
And he goes back to the New Statesman, too. So, I mean, it's just right back to what we're talking about.
All right, so continue on there with your narrative.
Okay, so let me just kind of go back. My video card's kind of lagging on me.
Yeah.
So I'm back at the New Statesman. So now we're looking at the New Statesman. We know that the Left Book Club was introduced through the New Statesman, Fabian Front. We know that Savage Civilization was, or Coconut Moon was introduced to the public, which then introduced mass observation to the public through the New Statesman. We can see that we have agents for the British government and Intel working for the New Statesman and writing for the New Statesman. I mean, what can you say about this publication other than the fact that it's just one big intel operation? I mean, everything about it just screams, I'm an agent. Look at me. We're messing with your minds. Don't. I mean, it's everywhere. I can't believe this evidence hasn't been really brought out and flushed out before. I think it's actually getting interesting too, because I think Jason Horsley mentioned that his brother was a writer for the New Statesman from time to time. I don't think he was hired as a specific writer, but freelance for him perhaps. But just another little tidbit that might be interesting to kind of look up what he wrote, see what he was, how he was involved with it. But anyway, so that's the New Statesman. And let's see, now where can we go from that? So we're looking at mass observation. Okay, so mass observation was funded initially through Savage Civilization, which had the poem Coconut Moon by Brigadier General Thomas Harrison. So Savage Civilizations initially funded mass observation. I can actually quote Tom Harrison about that. Would you like me to read that?
Sure, go ahead if you'd like.
So yeah, it's only probably about four paragraphs of pretty good information, about 2 pages out of a book, maybe about a page and a half.
Sure.
So the authors of The Long Weekend would presumably have filed Thomas Harrison under this heading, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so that has no meaning. In 1933, Harrison, indubitably middle class, and then a very young and very wild young man, as he described himself many years later, went to the New Hebrides with an Oxford University expedition and remained behind to live with the natives of Malekula, who were reputed to be cannibals. He shared their standard of living and went through the first steps of initiation into chieftainship, believing that he was on a new line of approach to civilization and human progress by studying cannibals. He came home and wrote Savage Civilization, which Gollancz accepted. While waiting for it to be published, he decided to observe the natives of Britain in the same way as he had studied those of Malekula. To this end, he traveled round England, coming to rest in Bolton, where he worked in a cotton mill from 7:45 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., oiling looms and pulling sacks. Quote, "I'm now engaged," he wrote, "with many helpers in the analysis of the civilization and how it has got into being what it is, whatever that is. It is an incredible and as intricate as the New Hebrides, but no more so." Thus was mass observation born, in a scruffy house in Bolton, pulsing with life and people. Its begetters were Tom Harrison and his friends Charles Madge. Harrison was convinced that he had found a new way of observing the human condition, as indeed he had. He had just the same kind of obsessive approach to his work as Victor himself, and he was frantic at the delay in publishing Savage Civilization, on which he was relying for funds to finance mass observation. He sent frequent angry letters, but letters which were disarming because of their youthful enthusiasm and exuberance, to Henrietta Street, demanding money. And here's a quoting from his letter directly. "What makes me feel so frustrated, and therefore write fiercely, perhaps foolishly, is that I feel, here I am, trying for the first time to do something that has never been done, is of vital importance, and yet I cannot get enough money to make it the success that it should, could, must be. You see, one man cannot tackle this job, as well as supporting the 3 men, all lately unemployed, named on this paper. I have to half support a whole lot of others, run a dictaphone, a house, etc. In order to make this possible, we are now living on means test diets, and shortly we'll have a period on an average local working malnutrition diet. I appreciate the work you have done for the working class. I am not working for exactly the same ideal, but I am working. Money in itself is no damn use to me, and I am happy as hell on 25 pence a week. I think there's no way of really delineating what that is, and I'm really bad with British monetary system, so I apologize to our British friends overseas.
Pounds?
I know, it's a 25/- so anyway, it's not important at the moment.
Oh.
I know that you have lived on very little. I've thrived. I can't believe he's saying that Victor Gollancz lived on very little. His father was a wholesale jeweler. I've thrived on a year at £4. The money I so urgently need is to pay others and to produce for you a book that will make you profits and bring you credit. At least that is my wish, and I'm going to all out deliver these goods. Now, this next paragraph I'm going to read right here is key, because this shows how savage civilization initially funded mass observation and then got it recognized by somebody very important. So when war came, Tom Harrison transferred his headquarters to a house in Holland Park in London to observe how people would react to the Blitz. One of his research workers was Celia Fremlin, who was later to become a writer of spine-chilling thrillers. She had published a book called Seven Shars of Chelsea, and Harrison asked if she would work for him. Each morning, a number of interviewers would set out with 12 questions to be put to random members of the public. Later in the day, and during the evening and night, they talked to people casually encountered to find out their views on topics of current interest. Most of this latter interviewing took place during air raids, the questionnaires turning round from shelter to shelter or fetching up on the actual site of an incident. The information was analyzed and passed on to the Ministry of Information, which eventually gave mass observation a grant so that the hard-pressed workers, who until then had functioned on a voluntary basis, could at last be paid, and for their pains become known as Cooper's Snoopers. It was a long time before Harrison and his research.
Wow,
Hold on a second. Wait, just 1 second. You're going to like this letter. It was a long time before Harrison and his research were taken seriously, though Julian Huxley supported them. And in a more qualified manner, the anthropologist Malinowski, the press general, ridiculed mass observation's claim to be a science. So you had Malinowski and Huxley backing him, but the press calling him.
Well, I mean, you never go more than 2 steps without stepping into a Huxley pile,
And then, of course, it's Cooper Snooper. So you have the first Minister of Information for the Ministry of Information, the founder of it, taking on mass observation.
But what they're doing is first you have the government creating this trauma situation with people being bombed out, right? So then they're in bomb shelters, and then you have spies for the British government in the bomb shelters, fishing information and pulling stuff and feeding it back as mass observation to further control and manipulate the people.
And it reminds me of Tavistock and their shell shock studies.
Well, absolutely. And of course, Tavistock, as we've shown repeatedly, is, tied into MK Ultra from, every way from Sunday. And, I mean, just look at all these. Well, you can't see it unless you've got it up on YouTube there. But, all of these connections from Tavistock, Tavistock funds the Grateful Dead. We were just discussing the Macy conferences. Well, the Macy conferences are out of the Tavistock Institute, okay, as well as the Central Intelligence Agency. We were just discussing cybernetics, which comes out of there. Tavistock, Artie Lang was at the Millbrook Mansion with Timothy Leary doing all of the stuff in Millbrook, New York, for the CIA, running the experiments there. So here's Artie Lang here, right back to the Tavistock Institute. So we're constantly circling back. So, basically, Tavistock goes up into where the heck are they now? For the Fabians. And let me just get that up here. And then the Fabians, Frankfurt School, here's Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley, he's a Fabian. He's tied in with the Tavistock Institute. So right now we're right back into the same group of people here, and we have, of course, Julian Huxley, Aldous' brother, running the eugenics, the dysgenics. And I know a lot of people get upset when I call it eugenics, but one thing I wanted to mention here is that all of these guys, that we've researched, I've never seen one of them admit that what they do is dysgenics. They always call it eugenics. We have Thomas Henry Huxley. We have Darwin. We have the Fabian Society here. We have George Bernard Shaw. We have, all of these different things are actually falling under eugenics. Now, for them, they think that they're promoting themselves up, and we are the target of this eugenics. We, the people, the masses, essentially are the ones who were being pushed out. And then you have, here's UNESCO, which is Julian Huxley's organization, tied into eugenics. Julian Huxley was signed on to the Eugenics Manifesto with Theodosius Dobzhansky. Theodosius Dobzhansky was a major eugenicist, but his daughter, get this, you like this, his daughter, Sophie Dobzhansky, was married to Professor Michael Coe, who created the 2012 movement. So while it's dysgenics, I mean, look, we're looking at groups of eugenicists here, and it's all of these eugenicists are promoting these different things. Here's Julian Huxley, one of the world's most famous eugenicists. Here's the Royal Society, which we're going to be going into here in a minute. But, looping right back to Thomas Henry Huxley. Thomas Henry Huxley was one of the first of the Royal Society. So these guys are essentially the core of the intelligence community. They're running eugenics programs. They're running mind control programs through the CIA, through MI6. This is why we see the Grateful Dead coming out of the Tavistock Institute. And I did, yes, go to the Grateful Dead concert last Wednesday. I had a great time. But it was amazing just sitting there as observers and people watching and looking at the damaged people everywhere at the Dead show. The CIA and the Tavistock Institute, SRI, et cetera, they have their people at these things just laughing it up, just going, yeah, look at it, and now it's self-perpetuating 50 years on. Half a century later, Bob Weir is still out there, all of the deadheads, a.k.a. zombies. When you get the joke, folks, a deadhead zombie, the deadheads, your listless druggies, those are the zombies for the zombie apocalypse.
And they're grateful for it.
Yeah.
I was actually at an antique store buying some old-time magazines that had, one was about, it was like a hippie commune. And the gentleman selling to me was a very nice man. Had a nice conversation with him, so I hope if he's listening, he doesn't take this the wrong way. But he told me that his brother had a pin saying that drugs or realities for people who can't handle drugs. Right. I was like, man, that's not something.
And you can just flip that, drugs are for people who can't handle reality,
Yeah. That's what I told him, and he's like, no. Like, all right, I'll just pay for this.
Yeah. Well, but I do want to get into, start going into Israel Gollancz and tying it into, I guess we've covered some of this. Hold on a second.
I guess we can work our way back to it. The way we could do that is sticking with mass observation. There's a link I can take us through that will then lead us back to Israel Gollancz. So if we look at mass observation, there's a man by the name of
your database.
Yeah, in my database.
All right, let me just pull that up here.
Sure. And if you look under the child for mass observation, you'll see a man by the name of Thomas Charles Lethbridge.
Yep, got it.
So Thomas Charles Lethbridge, if you click on his name, he is an archaeologist. He was into parapsychology. He was influenced by Margaret Murray, who was an Egyptologist. And
don't tell me you're gonna connect this to witch cults and ancient astronaut theories, right?
Well, that's exactly where I'm going, because you can see right there on the brain. So Thomas Charles Lethbridge, if you click on the ancient astronaut hypothesis, he's the man that came up with this. So if you find people like David Hatcher Childress, Erich von Däniken, Giorgio A. Tsoukalos, I think he's the one from the Ancient Aliens TV show. Right. Robert Kyle Grenville Temple and Zechariah Sitchin.
Okay, let me pull this up in mine. Hold on a second. Ancient Aliens.
Oh, so you have an Ancient Aliens. Okay.
Yeah, and then UFOs, close encounters, sightings, alien abductions, and then I've got all of these guys. I don't think I have your guy in there, though, so I'm going to have to plug him in there, but...
Yeah, it's from what I find, Thomas Charles Lethbridge is the one of the originators and proponents of that theory. What's interesting about him was why he was linked to mass observation was that during World War II, he was seeing ciphers being written all over London. I think it was London. And so a researcher was looking into that and seeing what he was finding, and he's finding like little like faces of Hitler all over the place, and he was trying to decode that to try to figure out if there were agents for the Nazis working on the London streets. So he would submit all of his findings to mass observation. His observations were all the ciphers he was finding in London during the time of World War II. And the only kind of information I could really find on it was through an artist who was given access to the archives by the name of, let me just pull it. The video on YouTube is called English Anxieties, and that was the name of the exhibit. It was by Tim Brennan. So Tim Brennan was the one that led me to Thomas Charles Lethbridge and his research into mass observation. It's about a 10-minute video on YouTube. Just a little interview about it. It's very interesting. Highly recommend looking into it. So going back to Thomas Charles Lethbridge, so ancient alien hypothesis. What better way if you're trying to cover up history or like engineering that you might not possibly be able to do, or engineering that you can do that you don't want other people to know that's possible to be done, than to cover it up with, that wasn't some man with a genius mind who was able to think about it and use grammar, logic, and rhetoric and design this. No, it was an ancient alien who came way back in time with his super technology, and he built that building. So, I mean...
And never mind where the aliens came from. What you're doing is you're constantly passing the buck off.
Exactly.
I'm glad you brought this up, because this is actually a good segue point, which is why... last week I wanted to have Cremo on as sort of a foundation to all of this. But when we, let's look at, we have the Piltdown Hoax, and that comes up. That was the most famous, so far exposed archaeological fraud to date. And it was done by, sorry folks, I hate to bring this name up again, Julian Huxley's friends.
Oh man, that's right. That is right. Yep.
So geez, I'm sorry. You really can't go anywhere in this without stepping in a Huxleyan pile of dew. But so Julian Huxley is working with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and he creates the Piltdown Hoax thing. Which also the Piltdown Hoax also becomes eventually, this is where guys like Terence McKenna developed the stoned ape theory. Now, interestingly, I just noticed in your brain database that Thomas Charles Lethbridge had the stoned tape theory. Now, I haven't looked into that, but stoned ape and stoned tape.
That's the first thing I thought when I saw that. Actually, stone tape. So what that is part of his parapsychology studies.
Right. Well, hold on. Before we go too far, though, let me just cover this back. So.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah,
Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, he's involved in this stoned ape, or this Piltdown man hoax that is a big fraud. Now, he's a big influence on somebody we just mentioned, Theodosius Dobzhansky, who was friends with the in-law of Michael Coe and friends with Julian Huxley. Michael Coe started the 2012 movement. Dobzhansky was another big player in UNESCO, founded by Huxley. Julian Huxley again. Huxley. Sorry for, I get sick of saying the Huxley's name so much. It's amazing to me that in all of this time, nobody had exposed the Huxley family being behind these massive CIA and intelligence projects. But now, when we go to UNESCO, the reason all of this is important is when we get over to Huxley's UNESCO, we have all of these archaeological sites around the world. Now, so let's just mention a few of them. How about the Stonehenge? Okay. And then if we go on to, now the official history is that Stonehenge, was, they just rebuilt it. Actually it was moved, it was aligned with the stars and all of this stuff. But we can see them. We can see a lot of photos online in the 1950s where they're actually building the thing. And, it's probably Google search would be better, but I hate to use Google. Here we can see the Disneyland stones that make up Stonehenge, and this is why they don't let people walk around it. They have to keep people off because it's all Disneyland display. And then, so they moved it. Ironically, there was an army base a few hundred yards outside of Stonehenge previously that is no longer there. So this is one of these archaeological sites that's moved, it's faked, etc. And then we get into Fomenko's research here, and then Fomenko is talking about in the whole end of his book, which I started talking about this week, how they faked the Dark Ages, and the more you look into the Dark Ages, and as I understand it more and more, I'm going to be expanding on it more and more. I have been in conversations and email conversations with Fomenko. I have not been able to get him to agree to come on the show, but we can see how, like in places like Athens, they actually altered, these sites. Like there's this tower there next to the Parthenon. You can see this tower right here, and what they did was they claimed that this was Ottoman, and they had to remove everything Ottoman. But then you go in, and closer photographs show that the stonework, etc., is identical, and that there's nothing showing that it was some ancient dig. They had a preconceived plan to basically create this notion of ancient Greece, and then they went and they knocked down anything that didn't fit that model, and they created it, and then they named all of these locations essentially UNESCO locations. And then we can go into ancient Egypt, and we can see, they did this in Athens in the 1860s, 1870s, and then we can see them doing this around the same time period in Egypt, and it looks like the British Academy of Sciences is involved in this thing. But then when we... and Fomenko is probably one of the most ridiculed scientists in the world. And when you get into his research, and when you remove the logical fallacies and you're thinking and what you think you know, and just dive into this guy's work, you find that, like for instance with the issue of Tartary, when you start looking at the history of Tartary and this massive nation's disappearance essentially, and complete erasure out of history. How come we're not taught about this, the world's largest country that stretched from Japan to Europe? How come we're not taught about it? And, they've basically erased it out. So when you factor in Tartary, you start realizing that the history of Rome, the way that we're taught, isn't possible. And then you realize that the Dark Ages were a fabrication. Well, let's say that the Dark Ages didn't really happen. Well, suddenly you have to collapse 1,000 years out of our history. And when you take, when you remove 1,000 years out of our history, not, one thing it does is it makes the year J964, not 2017, but, and you have all of these other issues that come up. But, the one thing that, see, when you're looking at this information, people need to realize that a contradiction is always a lie or an error. And, when you do a lot of historical research, there's all of these contradictions and weird things that I could never understand. And when you read Fomenko's work, these contradictions disappear by the hundreds. They just start flying away, and you're like, oh my God. And then you start realizing, well, the quote-unquote ancient Rome in Italy was actually founded in the late 13th, early 14th centuries. And then you can begin to see this whole other history play out with Constantinople or Zargrad. I say Zargrad because that's what I was always taught when I lived in Serbia. But and then this whole different dynamic going on with Tartary, and then you have the Inquisition in Europe suddenly happening in wait a second, the 15th and 16th century to squash out not witchcraft, but the Bacchanalia. And so then you have to start, rethinking everything, and it brings up whole new fascinating vistas of research. Just when you drop this fake, Scaligerine chronology. And then we had also discovered that Edward Bernays' grandfather wrote Scaliger's biography. and then, so they're going back and they're studying how propaganda was done. And another thing that we realize when ancient Rome disappears is that ancient Israel wasn't in its current location. And so that, brings up whole new interesting levels. But, Fomenko's written about 100 books laying out all of this information. And I recommend people at least read book number 1 and maybe his most recent book, How It Really Was, which they can read for free on his chronology website. But so this begins, to make a long story longer, this begins to tie back into your research and into, this whole group with the British Royal Society and with Israel Gollancz and these guys. So can you try to explain how this is starting to come together, and
Sure.
These pieces, ladies and gentlemen, are still, they're just now beginning to come into view after, doing a lot of research. And I wish I had read this book 12 years ago because,
Me too.
it really changes everything you think, and then you realize that, the main thing, even if 90% of what Fomenko wrote in his 100 books on this subject, even if 90% was wrong, if that 10% was right, which would amount to about 5,000 or 6,000 pages of new history, even if just that small amount were correct, it changes everything we think we know in the foundation of history. And then the main thing that we realize is that history cannot be, as we're told, is not linear. And pretty much from 1799 or 1699, somewhere thereabout, they changed the calendar, they plopped in the Dark Age, and they pushed the Bacchanalia back 1,000 years. They pushed the Inquisitions in Europe to suppress it back 1,000 years. And they had this new Rome in Italy. And then, we start seeing the break off of the evangelical church in a whole new light. With King Henry VIII and all of this stuff, creating the new it changes everything that we think we know. And suddenly, if the Vatican is prior in Constantinople, and then suddenly it moves in England, and then suddenly, King Henry is having fights with the Pope and stuff, all of a sudden this whole thing makes sense. And then you see the breakup, you see Protestantism and all of this stuff, coming out. So then it changes everything we think we know on this. So, and hundreds and hundreds of contradictions disappear in the official storyline. So this is why Fomenko is so important for people to understand. Regardless of what people tell you to think or believe, just go out there and read it and think for yourself and look at the data. And I would suggest reading more than just one of his books. It's phenomenal stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really cool stuff. I mean, I'm really enjoying the book. I'm just about finished with chapter 1 because I've been so busy reading so many different books. I'm just stacked up. I have a lot of research I have to do in a lot of different angles. So let's start bridging the gap here. We can kind of stay with T.C. Lethbridge. You asked initially, before we started with this, about the stone tape theory, because it sounded similar to the stone ape theory. And I'll just kind of clear that out of the way really quick. So stone tape theory links to his parapsychology research. And basically the theory was that instead of there being like ghosts or spirits kind of walking around or hauntings, that he created the idea that it was like a recording that you couldn't interact with. So that would be like the stone tape. It'd be like this tape of recording of something that happened a long time ago that just constantly recycles over and over again in a certain spot. And that's how we tried to explain hauntings, was through that theory. So essentially that's what that is, was a non-interactive ghosts. So another thing that's interesting about Thomas Charles Lethbridge is that he was a proponent of Margaret Murray's witch cult hypothesis. If we were sharing, are you sharing my...
Let me just pull that up again here, sorry.
And this isn't completely fully mapped out yet. There's still a lot that I need to do. But we can at least get going with it and see where it kind of leads. And Margaret Murray is interesting because she's an Egyptologist.
And so we're right back into it.
Yeah, so Margaret Murray is an Egyptologist. She was part of the first wave feminism movement. She studied folklore. She was the president of the Folklore Society. So she was responsible for kind of disseminating a lot of the myths and folklore of Ireland and England. So she's a lot of the fairy tales, basically anything about fairies or dwarves.
And just like we had already covered before, we see John Dee as key to creating the Canterbury Tales and the the Arthurian legends and all of that. And of course, he was the first official spy of England and Queen Elizabeth, or I think it was Queen Elizabeth, and all of this. So
yeah, he was like a spy, but there's actually somebody else who was officially her spy. I can't remember. He's in my brain. I'll have to link that real quick because I want to get that one out. Queen Elizabeth I.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
So that would be Sir Francis Walsingham was basically her right hand, and he was her spy master. And he would work closely with John Dee, who was probably one of the spies as well. But Sir Francis Walsingham is interesting because I believe he went to the University of Padua. Yes, that's correct. And he is responsible for creating the intelligence network throughout all of Europe for the Queen. So Sir Francis Walsingham, I think, was portrayed by, that wasn't Jeremy Irons, it was somebody else in the Elizabeth movie. I can't remember.
So we're seeing the myths, the legends, the spies in academic clothing, the archaeology, the history.
Yeah,
all beginning to be merged together into this coalescent whole that we can now begin to see and understand how the intelligence community essentially created it, how the elite class created it, how they used the humanists and the Theosophists, etc., to promote these ideas. Mm-hmm. You know, and then, what we should also mention is that then the Theosophists come in to create this idea. They start selling the idea, Madame Blavatsky, etc., to cover up this fake black hole that was created, or not black hole, excuse me, dark age. She then starts promoting that, all of these ancient cultures, see, here's the thing is if you take out 1,000 years, suddenly ancient Egypt and ancient Greece aren't so ancient, right? And so then what they did was to attack the Catholic Church. They then say, okay, well, Mithras, Krishna, Osiris, yada, 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 are all earlier versions of Christianity, and the Catholic Church is just a copy off of that. But if we took that 1,000 years out of there, suddenly we realize that these are essentially local versions of the exact same religion, right? Like you have the Egyptian one, you have the Persian version, you have the Russian or the Tartarian version, you have the Northern European version, and then they got the Bacchanalia going on in there. And so then the Vatican comes in to squash that, and then Madame Blavatsky and these people, they create this whole ancient history thing to then come around and attack the church like from another angle or something, it appears, at least superficially. It could be, a faked dialectic, but they create this roundabout attack to then, that then it ends up playing out in Acharya S.'s work and people that I had on the show years ago, rest in peace, right?
So actually, I'm glad you bring this up, especially the Theosophical Society, because we're talking about Margaret Murray and the witch cult hypothesis. William Butler Yeats, the poet, actually influenced her to kind of include within her hypothesis the fertility cults, which I know you've done some research on. And William Butler Yeats is part of the Theosophical Society. And what's interesting about Margaret Murray, I haven't found a direct tie. I'm sorry, what's that?
I have upstairs nearly every book on fertility cults from the 1770s to, the early 2000s, I think.
Might need to revisit them again and kind of take another look with this new lens. Yeah. But Margaret Murray, she was also a member of the Women's Social and Political Union, and that was founded by the Pankhurst family. And the Pankhurst family, there were the children were raised among, I think, the Webbs in the Fabian Society. If I remember this correctly, let me just kind of go back here really quick. see, Emmeline Pankhurst. Oh, she was friends with Annie Besant. That's what it was. And so the children grew up basically with the Theosophical Society, but they were also
and then that goes directly into the UN.
And then the Pankhursts were also part of the Fabian Society. So then their children, I think one of the children created the Communist Party.
So then they create the UN to solidify this official version of history and everything?
I could see that, yeah. Well, the Pankhursts, they created the Communist Party in Australia and then also a Communist Party in Britain. And basically, I mean, that's just one shady family, and they did a lot of odd stuff. Just doesn't make any sense that they could get away with the kind of stuff that they did, but they did. So Margaret Murray.
Yep.
So we'll go back to her. So Margaret Murray. So let me just go back to that myself because I'm way off.
I've got her up on screen here.
Okay, so she was her mentor was Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie he's a fellow of the Royal Society as well as a fellow of the British Academy. Now, what's interesting about her mentor, who encouraged her to continue her studies in Egyptology and move away from social work, he was the man who found the Merneptah stele. I'm going to pronounce that incorrectly, so I apologize. It's also known as the Israel stele, or the Victory Stele of Merneptah. And this is the oldest, quote unquote, oldest reference to Israel in any writing. And that's by consensus, not by fact.
So this guy creates this, and then so just a minute ago, Jacob, I was mentioning that Israel probably originally wasn't in this location. We probably had the Templars or somebody going back and planting evidence. You got to shift everything when you realize that they faked the Dark Ages, which was just an excuse to explain a lack of information and a fake number system they created. Oh, well, there's nothing in between these periods. We're going to call that the Dark Age. It's just an empty 1,000 years. They didn't learn anything. People were just stupid as rocks. Or if you just take that section out, then you start seeing this thing play out, and then you realize, okay, ancient Rome was founded in the Middle Ages in the late 13th century in Italy, and then previously it was in Constantinople. And so then you have this guy that you were just mentioning.
Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie.
Right, exactly. And then he's the one who puts out the stela that is the oldest thing that identifies Israel.
Yes,
is this one of these situations where we say, nothing to see here, folks, move along?
I mean, it's a controversial thing, too. People contest it still to this day that those lines don't say that, and it's not Israel. So, I mean, I'm not a student of hieroglyphics, so I can't put my 2 cents into that. But Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie also was the person who kind of created the systematic methodology in archaeology and how to preserve artifacts. So here's the man who finds this tablet and also creates the methodology for excavating, and then also how to preserve the artifacts. So he's completely controlled, and he's created an entire system for archaeology. He created the British School of Archaeology in Egypt, which is interesting because that was through the British Academy, which was founded by Sir Israel Gollancz, and he helped fund it through his friends. And he created the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, which was founded under the British Mandate for Palestine. So now we're seeing the British Academy finding the first reference to Israel through Sir Petrie.
You can see where this is all going.
So you see them laying the groundwork for where Israel supposedly was through the British Academy and Petrie. And then later, they can then use that as their influence to basically invade Palestine and conquer the land. I mean, this is basically just evidence to create a land grab, it almost seems like. And now with this speculation, we don't have direct evidence that says that he did this, but now we have forensic evidence that could lead us towards more clues.
Yeah. And here's the thing is it's showing that, all of this is actually revealing that Fomenko's work is correct in a dozen different directions.
Oh, yeah.
And he looks at it from mathematical algorithms, and he's Not quite sure how our investigating Julian Huxley and the Piltdown Hoax and UNESCO and Gollancz and all of these guys connects to his work, but now we're beginning to see...
Yeah, we're getting the grammar together now.
We're getting the grammar together now, where we're beginning to see how this stuff really ties together. So, hopefully I'll be able to, soon put together something cogent enough to send to Fomenko to, get him to come on the show, or maybe, send him this so that he can begin to see. Here's the issue: is his work, at least his earlier work, focuses on the history and what was actually done. It's not focusing on the players and who did it, and their connections and ties to British intelligence and the British Royal, Academy and all of this stuff. So, and then we see, ironically, possibly, the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is what Fomenko is a part of, exposing all of this.
Oh my goodness, yeah, that's a nice parallel right there,
isn't it? Right. And then you have,
they're kind of crashing into each other.
Well, and you have this sort of battle going on then between the Russian Academy of Sciences, the British Academy of Sciences, and the Vatican and the Ecole Biblique, etc., going on, right? So it's this three-way fight and it seems, from the surface anyway, what we're beginning to see is that the Russian Academy of Sciences is actually telling the truth, because when we look at it from the angle of Gollancz and all of this stuff, and from the angle of UNESCO and these sites and the cleaning up of the history, we're looking at Fomenko's work from a totally different angle and saying, yeah, this all checks out.
And I can actually add to this. So I just mentioned how Sir Petrie was the man who kind of promoted the systematic methodology in excavating and archaeology and preserving of artifacts. And his protege, Margaret Murray, is questioned quite a bit about her tactics and methods for excavating, because she would just kind of go without permission somewhere and dig and then make declarations that she found something. So she's heavily criticized for this, but people still accept her findings as being genuine. But without ever getting any permission or documenting where she's going or why she's going to do something, it kind of eliminates the paper trail of everything. And it's almost like you could just kind of dig in the sand and just pull up something you planted the day before. So she's kind of shady in a lot of ways when it comes to that. And then if you look at her witch cult hypothesis, it almost seems like she kind of links it to Baphomet and the Horned God and stuff like that, almost as a way to kind of whitewash maybe what the old religion really was. So it almost might be that, she's kind of somebody who is a cover-up agent, and she kind of uses her research into folklore and witch cults as a way of giving an old religion a misnomer and false grammar.
Well, and think of the witch hunts. Now, let's say that, the Dark Ages didn't exist and that it's actually the Bacchanalia, and then I have it in the brain database that the whole witch hunts were manufactured, and there's a talk or something in the database, I forget, maybe an article I read that broke down all of the grammar, and they had investigated all of the so-called witch hunts, and all that they could find was on the area, on the border of Germany, or on the border near Germany, in like a few areas, but there was no widespread attempt by the Catholic Church to wipe out witches. But this whole introduction of the Bacchanalia being a 14th through 17th century cult changes everything. And not only that, but it also changes, our whole view of exposing MK Ultra and, the Fabians and the AJC and Tavistock and SRI and the CIA and MI6 promoting psychedelics everywhere, bringing back the Dionysian mysteries and the Bacchanalia, I mean, it's like, wait a second, so, maybe all of this is an attack on the Catholic Church. Maybe they finally got the Catholic Church in tow with that scene they did last year. I don't know. More grammar needs to be done there. But, how would you recommend people get over their prejudices and preconceptions of Fomenko's work and of questioning linear history as we've been sold it?
Well, that's a tough one, but it's not tough. You should just be willing to study an idea without accepting it. Like that's what Aristotle supposedly said, right? Was that quality of a good mind was somebody that can entertain, as I'm paraphrasing, entertain an idea without accepting it. I just totally butchered that, but essentially read the book, take the grammar in, and then try to verify every citation you can find. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's Russian in there that if you look in the bibliography, but it doesn't mean everything is. I mean, I have some encyclopedias I can look up and kind of verify.
Let's just put a team together to go spend a few weeks in Russia and hang out at Moscow University with Fomenko and hit him up for all his citations.
That would be a lot of fun.
That would be a lot of fun. I would
That'd
have
be
a
great.
blast. I love nerding out in libraries. So anyway, Jacob, it's 6 p.m. Do you have anything else you want to add? Is that a wrap?
Let's see. We talked about Margaret Murray, and we kind of went into Israel Gollancz. I mean, was there did you want to go any deeper into Margaret Murray and the witch cult hypothesis at all with the fertility cults? And
yeah. I mean, sure. Since, we can just continue on if the audience wants more time. If they don't, they can click off right now. Bye.
But otherwise, I mean, it's just kind of, other research that I've kind of found that is just kind of sparse that we could probably just share.
Yeah, just go through it briefly and, and just kind of get people familiar with it.
Well, let's see. I don't think I worded that correctly. It's more of the actually, well, we're talking about the Academy. I think, what was it? Sir Henry James Murray was part of the British Academy, if I remember correctly, who founded was one of the founders of the Oxford English Dictionary. This is just kind of a side thing. This has nothing to do with what we were just talking about, but it has something to do with the Gollancz family and their ties to messing with language and history. I have this book called Personalia, relating to Sir Herman Gollancz, and it's basically a tribute to him before he died or after he died. And there's a letter from that he wrote. There's an obituary for Sir Henry James Murray. Basically, he was talking about how he was the Hebrew philologist for the Oxford English Dictionary. So if you're looking for any roots from the English language back to Hebrew, there was probably Hermann Gollancz that came up with those translations and did all the work for the Oxford English Dictionary. So, I mean, that's some interesting little tidbit there that the Gollancz family is connected to. What else could I kind of come up with the top of my head? I mean, everything's kind of scattered and disjointed. Actually, you brought up UNESCO. That's still fresh in my mind. If you look at my brain for UNESCO, I can link this all the way back. I can link this back to mass observation. UNESCO created is the executive arm for the International Society for Education Through Art.
Yep.
And that was co-created by Sir Herbert Edward Reed, who's an associate of Humphrey Jennings, of all people. And they both helped create the 1936 Surrealist exhibition in London. So Humphrey Jennings in mass observation, I mean, he was involved with bringing the surrealist art of
and there's Salvador Dali, and wow, we're already right back there.
So, I mean, you could look at it. I mean, these people influence everything. They're in the arts, they're in education, they're in the literary societies, they're in academia, they are in anthropology, archaeology, anything that has to do with the arts of man. These people have infiltrated.
And completely altered and changed to give us a false perception of the past. And I think, one thing that, and you mentioned earlier about the ancient alien stuff and all of this, which, we couldn't have done that. It was this UFO group that did it. We couldn't have done that. It was levitating beings with, whatever. Humans had special powers or something. And then when you realize that the Dark Ages is manufactured and you take out that 1,000-year gap, then suddenly you're only looking back a few hundred years and you're going, wait a second, we did that not so long ago.
Yeah.
And then the questions and the attitude that you approach it as begin to change. And then, so Tartary is just one aspect of the cover-up. They're trying to cover up, not so distant past, medieval technology and things like that, trying to make it look like ancient Egypt and ancient Athens, they were magnificent thousands of years ago and we've declined since then. And then, came back after the so-called Renaissance and all of that. But if you take out that 1,000-year gap, suddenly it's just a continuous stream of technology. And then in the last few hundred years, you have this group suppressing the history of Tartary, suppressing, the true history of Europe, of Russia, of Israel, for that matter, of Palestine and all of this, manufacturing a whole new history. And, with so many contradictions in it that, it's unexplainable any other way until you begin to study Fomenko and look at his research. And if people want to claim that Fomenko plagiarized somebody, explain the mathematical algorithms and the 100 books that he's published since 1973 on the subject. But, ladies and gentlemen, if you appreciated what you heard tonight and on the UnSpun show on Gnostic Media in general, please support the show. Jacob, do you want to give out your contact information, etc.?
Yeah, if you'd like to email me, you can send me a message at jacobduellman@gmail.com. That's JACOBDUELLMAN @gmail.
And, of course, the website, gnosticmedia.com. You can donate at the top of the show. Please get a membership. You can also buy other books and stuff on the website. I need to get the website updated and get other stuff up there soon. I'll be hopefully getting that going soon. Always so much to do, so little help and support. But I appreciate everyone who does support and contribute. We can't do it without you. Jacob, see you soon. Talk to you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, good night. And until next week, bye-bye.